Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to yet another digital upside down event brought to you by NN Investment Partners. Meanwhile, many additional local upside down events have been taking place in different markets, as you were able to see in the video loop prior to the start of this webcast. Now, when we were here last time, we kicked off the series with a lively discussion between the CIO of NN Investment Partners, Valentijn van Nieuwenhuizen, and Peter Diamandis. Together, Valentijn and Peter discussed the overall implications on the economy, as well as the change brought about by COVID-19. Today, we'll dive deeper into yet another area where NN Investment Partners believes the pandemic will have a profound effect: responsible investing. My name is Marije Groen, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Nobel Prize-winning economist Professor Joseph Stiglitz and NNIP's Principal for Responsible Investing, Adrie Heinsbroek, who is right here with me in the studio. Welcome, Adrie. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Marije, and it's my pleasure being here.
Thanks so much. Now let's talk a bit more about today's lineup. To hand over from our last discussion, we will briefly be joined by Peter Diamandis to get some of his reflections on the last event. Then both Professor Stiglitz and Adrie will share their thoughts on how COVID-19 is impacting and will continue to affect the field of responsible investing. After both of their keynotes, which have been pre-recorded just to make our lives a bit easier technically, we'll open up the live fireside chat, during which Adrie and Professor Stiglitz can ask each other some questions. And this is where you come in, and you also get the opportunity to ask your questions. That brings me to some of the practicalities, which those of you who were here last time will probably remember. Please use the chat function to send in your questions, and don't forget to signal who your question is for Professor Stiglitz, for Adrie, or maybe for both. And you don't have to wait until the Q&A. Feel free to send in your questions as they come to mind, because we gather them up as we go. Also, let me take a moment to explain to you how this platform actually works. So where we currently are is the stage, the main stage, where the speakers will be hosting their keynotes and where we will have the fireside chat and also the Q&A. At the end of the event, which will be at 4:35 p.m. Central European Time, a networking button will appear. Please click that button if you wish to network with some of the other event participants. You will automatically be matched with someone else. Look out for any pinned messages on top of the chat for announcements from the crew here. And in case you're experiencing any technical issues, please send us a message in the chat by using @NNIP, and the team here will try to respond to you as quickly as possible. Now let's kick things off by welcoming back Peter Diamandis.
Hi there, guys. Good morning,
Hi,
good
Peter.
afternoon, good evening. Yes, we're
so good to see you again,
to
Peter. Good to have you back. And I realize it is early morning for you, so we really appreciate you tuning in with us. How have you been doing?
I've been busy, and a lot of the CEOs, a lot of the entrepreneurs that I know are heads down. I'm actually working harder than ever before with an incredible amount of energy and passion, driven by sort of the pandemic going on. You know, people say it's been, never let a good, disaster go to waste, and either
never
from
waste
a
crisis.
never waste a good crisis here. So on my end, it's been, today is a big day for one of my companies, Kovacs. We're announcing we've been developing a vaccine for COVID-19. I'll be in press conferences all the rest of the day. We're announcing our science data, our preclinical data. We're going to humans next month, and we're just, it's extraordinary. We think it's one of the most effective mass manufacturable vaccines out there, and hope to be the first to 100 million. So that's been keeping me busy. And I think a vaccine is going to be one of the critical things to bring us back towards normalcy. And then the other thing I've been working on is we just launched an X Prize funded by Mark Benioff, the chairman and CEO of Salesforce, to develop a new generation of face masks. Masks that don't fog your glasses, or aren't hot, or not hard to exercise, and solve the issues. So If anybody's interested in that, if you go to xprize.org, you'll learn about that. But more than that, a lot of my friends are just reinventing their companies, reinventing how they deliver their business. And I think as an entrepreneur, that's what we do best, is figure out the challenges and then figure out how to solve them and create new business models.
Yeah. Well, a lot of exciting stuff, and we're staying tuned to follow that. Just looking back at the last event when you joined us here a couple of weeks back, wondering if you have any reflections on the chat that we had, and maybe any reflections you'd like to share with us today.
So I think the reflection that I have for those who joined us last time, welcome back. I talked about the notion that we have these asteroid impacts that, 66 million years ago, an asteroid struck the Earth, and the environment changed so fast that we saw a die-off in the dinosaurs and the evolution of the furry mammals that evolved into us. Over the last decade, we've seen another asteroid strike, which is exponential technologies, which have transformed so many industries. We've seen this major die-off in retail as Amazon, for example. One of the furry mammals, if you would, has come into dominance. And then COVID-19 has been another asteroid strike. And I think that analogy works well. I think that what is proving out to be true is this is not something which is just going to go away, that we probably have another year of turbulence. A lot of people are not good at self-isolating, wearing a mask. I mean, if everybody wore a mask for 3 weeks, we would wipe out this pandemic like throwing water on a fire. But people are not good at human behavior. Is not something that's easily modeled and easily changed rapidly. So this is something that's going to be with us for another year. I think we do need a vaccine. We do need better therapeutics. And I think one of the things that's important as well for me is that the technology we have to be able to respond to these changes, these exponential technologies are going to create new ways of living. Healthcare is transforming, education is transforming massively, both of those industries, as well as retail and even real estate. So I think everything we talked about is as valid and more so. A lot of people thought this was going to be gone over the summer. It is definitively not gone, and we go into flu season again. So we have at least, by most guesses, another 6 months, probably a year ahead of us before we're going to start to see any return of normalcy. And then one can say this is the new normal. Hopefully not.
Now, we really enjoyed here last time hearing how optimistic you are about the impact that the exponential change can have post-COVID. Fitting maybe with the theme of today, we're talking about responsible investing. So what would be your one guiding thought on how to tackle that change responsibly?
So I think your mindset is one of the most important things that you have. If you are pessimistic and think the world is ending, you're going to take actions in that direction. I think all of us need to realize that the technology to solve the pandemic is there, that it is going to happen, that we need to constantly think about, from a mindset standpoint, how do we reinvent our business model, how do we add more value to people's lives, and how do we be responsible with our health, wear a mask. It's still one of the most important things that we can do. I think that for me, for everybody, it's the mindset with which you do everything, including your responsible investing. And it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a real honor for me to pass the torch of this conversation to Nobel laureate Professor Joseph Stiglitz. It's an honor to have him follow me in this. So I wish everybody an amazing, part 2 of the NN Upside Down. It's, again, a pleasure for me to be part of it.
Thank you again for being here, Peter, and stay healthy and safe over there in California. We are following the news, and we think of you. Our thoughts are with you. So Thank you so much for being here. I would now like to introduce Professor Stiglitz in New York.
I want to begin by thanking NN Investment Partners for inviting me to speak at the Upside Down series. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I wish I could be there in person. Among the questions I want to address are what has just happened to our world as a result of COVID-19? How does this accelerate or disrupt thinking on responsible investing and sustainability? How does it that it touches governments, corporations, and individuals? Will the COVID-19 crisis speed up or slow down our progress on the path towards a more sustainable and inclusive society? And finally, how has all of this affected our measurements in finance at the corporate level and at the national level? I've emphasized in some of my earlier work that measurement matters. What we measure affects what we do. GDP doesn't measure the health of an economy well because it doesn't adequately capture the well-being of our citizens, either in terms of their health and happiness or in their capacity to live up to their potential. Nor does GDP reflect sustainability in any of its dimensions, environmental, social, political, or even economic. We need new measurements that reflect our values and the state of our society as a whole. COVID-19 has highlighted a series of interconnections that are obfuscated in standard GDP measurements between the health of the economy and the health of our citizens, between inequality and overall economic performance, between short-term performance, resilience, and sustainability. Each of these themes plays out at the level of the enterprise, the nation, and the world. And I want to spend a few minutes towards the end of this talk highlighting some of the implications of COVID-19 for globalization. As we watch the pandemic spread around the world, we've seen differences among how different countries have responded. Some were better prepared to address the COVID-19 crisis. Some responded better, both to the threat of the health of their citizens and to their well-being and that of the economy. We've learned an awful lot in a very short time. I could only touch on a few of the points today. Let me begin by emphasizing one of the things that we've learned is that one can't have a healthy economy without a healthy population. The fear of the disease is what caused the decline, not government lockdowns. Premature openings have led to an increase in disease with adverse effects on the economy. Those who argue that we faced a trade-off between the health of our citizens, particularly elder citizens like me, and the health of our economy, I think those were false trade-offs. We've seen it in the United States, what's happening today in some of the southern states in the United States. And here in Europe, Sweden has perhaps provided a similar example. The second thing I want to emphasize is that we won't have a V-shaped recovery. At the beginning of the pandemic, many people thought if we just put the economy into a hospital, as it were, into hold for a relatively short period of time, gave it loving care and a lot of money, we would emerge in a few weeks, 10 at most, picking up where we left off in January or February. Well, we designed programs predicated on those beliefs, and we're now well beyond that 10-week period, and it is very clear that the pandemic and some of the economic devastation is still with us. So that means we are going to have to be thinking about recovery plans that are going to be extended over a long period of time. More generally, this has many implications. It means that we will have to sustain our efforts to support the economy. Otherwise, what is being spent will be for naught. This is a very big issue in the United States because some were looking at the deficits, which are already looking like 15, 18% of GDP for the current fiscal year, have worried about continuing support, even for our basic unemployment insurance system, let alone the kind of broader measures that will be required for recovery. And I've emphasized that unless you provide this kind of some kind of sustained support, the $3 trillion that we've already provided will have been for nothing. Of course, the high level of spending, the high level of deficits mean that we have to make sure the money is well spent. We have to make sure our programs are well designed. And part of being well designed means that we must be sure our money does what I call double duty. It will help create the kind of economy we want after the pandemic. That means we have to have responsible public investment. Never has government intervened in the magnitude that it has in this pandemic, far larger even than in the 2008 crisis, which was the most massive public response up to that date. And because of this massive government intervention, citizens have the right to demand that that money help shape the economy in the ways that accord with the kind of society, the kind of economy that they want to emerge at the other side of the pandemic. And this is why I think it's really important that we not have as our objective just picking up where we left off in January, February, March of 2020. We want the economy that emerges to be different. The economy that we had was an economy based on fossil fuels. We want to move to a green economy. It was an economy rife with inequalities. I'll come back to talk about that, but the pandemic has exposed the magnitude of these inequalities, especially in health. We want to be more of a knowledge-based economy. And yet one of the ironies of what is going on is that the knowledge sectors, our universities, our schools, are among the sectors which have been most devastated by the pandemic. And unfortunately, here in the United States, there's been almost no assistance provided to that sector. The government has multiple instruments by which it can help shape the economy that's going to emerge after the pandemic. It can affect what happens through the allocation of funds, and it can affect it by imposing conditionalities on those who receive the funds. Some countries have really taken this to heart. Europe has done a much better job on this than the United States. In the recovery packages that Europe has put together, there's been a real vision of where they want to go, particularly in creating a sustainable green economy. Some countries, like France, when they gave money to the airlines, they imposed very strong conditions that the airline move towards a lower carbon footprint. Unfortunately, in the United States, there was no discussion at all about this vision, about what kind of an economy. No conditions were imposed. If anything, there were some perversities in the kind of allocations, with money going in the opposite direction of where we would want to go, and money not going in the direction that was really needed. I want to spend a few minutes reflecting on some of the differences in how things have worked out in different parts of the world, both what was done before the pandemic and what has been done in the midst of the pandemic. One of the reasons Europe was better able to contain the disease, and there's dramatic differences between Europe on the one hand and the United States on the other, and Brazil, say, as another example. One of the reasons it did better was its better system of social protection, its lower level of inequality. Let me just give you one example. Paid sick leave. The United States does not have mandatory paid sick leave. And that means with such a large fraction of our workers, including and particularly our frontline workers, living paycheck to paycheck, having less than $500 in their bank account. What that means is if they get sick, if they are able to go to work, they do go to work, helping spread the disease. Congress recognized that this was a problem, and they passed a legislation requiring, mandating paid sick leave just for COVID-19, not for other diseases. But then, under the influence of the lobbying of the largest firms, those with more than 500 employees, these companies were exempted. And that was an exemption, exempting close to half of the labor force in the United States. I think it was short-sighted. I think it was unconscionable. And part of the result were the things, the hotspots that we've seen, like in meatpacking plants, that have become real places for the spread of the disease. The disease, the virus, is not an equal opportunity virus. It attacks particularly those in poor health conditions. And one of the reasons it's been so virulent in the United States is that we have a lot of people in poor health conditions. Actually, life expectancy in the United States today, 2020, is lower than it was 5 years ago. It's partly because we don't recognize the right of access to healthcare as a basic human right. And one of the implications of that is that we have huge health disparities. And so there was a fertile field, as it were, for COVID-19. The irony, of course, is that our frontline workers, those workers who are most exposed, providing some of the most important services, including our healthcare services, are among the lowest paid, have the weakest health conditions, and are the least able to cope. A third aspect that became very clear as the disease spread was that the dismantling of governments, the disparagement of governments, has made them less capable of responding. We'd been warned, in a sense, by SARS, by MERS, even by the Ebola crisis, that the threat of a pandemic was real. In fact, in the United States, under the Obama administration, a White House office on pandemics was created. We created national stockpiles for essential health things like masks and protective gear. But in, you might say, part of the attack against government and part of the short-sightedness that I'll come to in a minute, the Office of Pandemic was disbanded, the stockpiles were depleted, and the critical agency for responding to the crisis, the Centers for Disease Control was defunded. So in responding to the crisis, some countries had weaker social protections. The United States was an example, and therefore were less well prepared. And the government, which is always in the front line of dealing with disasters, whether it's a health disaster or a natural catastrophe, that had been weakened. But I think what surprised a lot of people, not just in the United States, but in a number of other countries, was the inability of the private sector to respond, the lack of resilience of the private sector, the inability to produce even simple products like masks. Evidently, we had created a private market economy that in at least some dimensions lacked resilience. It was short-sighted. It was focused on short-run profits without adequate regard to the risks that might be up front. In a way, this reminds us of what happened in 2008 when short-sighted markets again had not prepared for the kinds of contingencies that were quite plausible. I've given an analogy. One of the things that happened a lot in the United States is that we have cars without spare tires. We focused on the ability to save a little bit of money in the short run. After all, normally you don't have a flat tire, so normally you don't need a spare tire. It seems a waste to have that carry around this extra weight in the car and to spend the extra money up front for a spare tire. But when you have a flat tire, that spare tire becomes very important. So we created cars, in a sense, without resilience. And those who've had a flat tire in places that are relatively remote know how costly that can be. One aspect of that lack of resilience is that we created global supply chains that were insufficiently diversified. And as we look forward, this is part of the main theme of the talk, we are not prepared for one of the most important risks that we are going to be facing, climate change. Climate change has not gone away as we've been fighting the pandemic. The evidence coming in is things are worse. Every year we find that things are worse than we had anticipated. So one of the things that this risk that we were not adequately prepared for should remind us that we need to be prepared for climate change. That climate change will happen is not a question. The only question is how fast and how devastating. And all of the evidence is mounting that it will be more rapid than had been previously anticipated, with more devastating effects. Now, one of the reasons that I think our economy has often gone in the wrong direction, both at the public and the private level, is we've had metrics that have not revealed the problems. About a decade ago, I chaired an international commission called the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. And following the report of that commission, a high-level expert group was set up at the OECD. We argued that GDP was not a good measure of economic performance. It captured one important aspect, but there were many things that did not adequately capture: inequality, sustainability, health. All of these are, of course, important in the context of climate change. We face systemic fragility. There will be stranded assets. The changes in the prices of fossil fuel assets may happen very dramatically. And that revaluation of carbon assets could lead to a systemic problem. And it is important that our metrics reflect that kind of systemic risk. And I hope that one of the things that will emerge from this pandemic is a realization that we were ill-prepared for the risk of pandemics. We've been warned about pandemics and we didn't take appropriate actions, and our metrics didn't reflect that risk. We now have been warned about climate change. We have better metrics. We have ways of assessing systemic fragility, carbon fragility, and we ought to be putting those into practice. There was an interesting article in the Financial Times recently suggesting that assets with better ESG ratings have done better. One of the reasons is that these assets have, for the most part, reflected more long-term thinking. And what has repeatedly gotten us into trouble is short-termism. One of the reasons for using better metric is that they help encourage more long-term thinking. But there are other reforms also that I believe that could move us more in the direction. Tax policy, reforms in corporate governance. For instance, one of my colleagues, Patrick Bolton, has been a big advocate of what are called loyalty shares. As I've looked around the world at the wide variety of responses to COVID-19 in Europe, New Zealand, Korea, US, and Brazil, some have done extraordinarily well. Some have been very disappointing. And I want to talk a little bit about what I see as some of the keys to the success. Part of it has been magnitude of the response, but as more important has been the design of the programs and the trust in both the private and the public sectors. The U.S. had a response that was massive in scale, but there was a lack of trust. There was a lack of trust in science and expertise, and this led to a poor design. And the result of that poor design is both a failure to contain the disease, but also the highest level of increase in the unemployment. The lack of trust is also showed up in the private sector because the lack of trust in the private sector has meant that we cannot rely on the tests for the disease that the private sector provides. There are just too many scammers out there. And that means we have to have government testing, which of course then interacts with the dismantling of the state, put it in a poor position to do the testing of the tests. And the result is we've not been able to produce tests in the quantities that we've needed. The lack of trust in science and experience, combined with the massive misinformation, has meant that large fractions of Americans say that today, that even were the vaccine available, they would not take advantage of it. Finally, I want to turn to some of the global aspects of what is going on. Earlier, I referred to the rethinking of the global supply chains. And that is going to result, I think, to some extent in, you might call it a limited degree of deglobalization. The COVID-19 has made us aware of our global interdependence. And that has, I think, a couple of important implications. We won't have a healthy planet. We won't have a healthy global economy until the disease is controlled everywhere and there's been a global economic recovery. The pandemic is now moving to the developing countries and emerging markets. And these countries are more vulnerable. Their health status is weaker. They don't have the health facilities to respond. They don't have the economic resources to respond to the inevitable economic downturn that a lockdown will result in. And therefore, both in terms of health and in terms of the economy, there is a real risk that they will be affected much worse than the much more adversely than the advanced countries. And we're already beginning to see that these concerns play out in Latin America. This crisis, the importance of getting a global strong response to contain it, is even more important than in 2008, where the G20 was actually founded to get a global response. But in the response to the 2008 recovery, global financial crisis, China played a central role. Its economy grew at 10, 11, 12, 13%, and it was the fuel for the global recovery. But now the forecasts are that China's recovery is going to be very muted. It will be one of the few places in the world that will be growing. But not only is its growth going to be slow, China appears to be focusing on the growth of their domestic demand. And the recent data suggests their trade surplus is actually growing. So they won't be the engine of economic growth. And so we will have to have every part of the world doing its part. The international community, I think in some ways recognize this. The G20 said at its last meetings that it would use all instruments at its disposal. But then what happened was somewhat disappointing. One of the important instruments are global money. It's called special drawing rights, SDRs. The IMF has the authority to issue $500 billion of these. They were issued in the response to the 2008 crisis, but this time the US has blocked their issuance. The G20 said that we needed a standstill on debt. While the rest of the world was put on hold, the financial markets continued to charge interest. But the standstill that the G20 agreed to was very limited. It was for the poorest countries, and it was only for official debt. And we need a standstill. We need to do something for the emerging markets and for the private debt. And right now, what we're seeing is, you might say, just the opposite of what we need. The creditors, especially in the US, some people from the UK, are precipitating what I think of as could be a global debt crisis. They're refusing to restructure the Argentines' debt. They're demanding new contracts, providing more scope for vulture funds. And it is providing it's a great concern, because it is very likely that one of the consequences of the pandemic will be a rash of sovereign debt defaults in the next year or two. So let me conclude by trying to summarize what I think of 7 major messages that I've tried to convey today. The first is that the health of a country and its people and that of its economy are inseparable. Secondly, the excessive emphasis on the short term resulted in an economy which has less resilience, governments which were less prepared to respond to a pandemic, such as that which we are now facing. The third is that COVID-19 has brought home the importance of long-term thinking. of responsible investment, both in the private and the public sector, of sustainability and resilience, and of creating a society with the appropriate balance between markets, the state, and civil society. We have to have a society that is more inclusive. Fourthly, those societies that responded best were those that shown a respect for science and expertise, where there was a sense of solidarity among citizens, only possible when there's a certain degree of inclusivity, and where there was trust in the government and in the private sector. Next, we have to, and we can, do a better job of reflecting these broader objectives in our metrics. And next to last, we can and we should use the opportunity afforded by the massive interventions by governments in the economy to ensure that the economy which emerges is a different economy than the economy we had before: greener, more equal, healthier, and more knowledge-based. And finally, pandemics, like climate change, are global in nature and can only be addressed through global cooperation. There's much more to be said about all of these topics, and I'm looking forward to getting into a deeper discussion with all of you after Adre's perspectives are presented. Thank you.
Well, that wraps up Professor Stiglitz's keynote. He will be joining us live in a moment for the Q&A. Meanwhile, let me just remind you again, we see many questions coming in, but you can continue to hand in your questions via the chat function, and please signal who your question is for, either for Professor Stiglitz or maybe for Adri or for both. Now let me hand over to Adri Heinsbroek, Principal for Responsible Investing at NN Investment Partners. Adri will share some of his thoughts on the big themes investors should be exploring to continue to invest responsibly in the aftermath of COVID-19.
Good afternoon. During the COVID pandemic, we experienced a sudden disruption to our lives, our ways of doing business, and the experience we had with our surroundings. Our short term was and is on survival. Let me be clear on that, both economically and socially. But in order to ensure we thrive in the longer term, we need to shift our focus. We need to understand how the different stakeholders in our society will behave, not just to ensure a healthy society, but also to build a resilient economy. We already can see that corporate adaptability and corporate responsibility helps build this resilience from an investment performance perspective. We can also see that the immediate consequences of the pandemic are unbalanced. On the one hand, economic hardship is experienced more quickly, more heavily by those who have the least economic resilience. Think about people with temporary jobs or work in the informal economy. They have lost sources of income. And on the other hand, the slowdown does show positive effects on our planet, something few expected at the outside. In urban areas all over the world, we experience now again the blue skies and clean air. So now we need to work to understand how we can support sustainable change with all of the stakeholders required. And we see that transition towards a more balanced and inclusive economy is both dependent on and steers developments for three key groups, being governments, corporates, and ourselves as individuals. And these three groups form a triangle that is not just linked, but also mutually dependent. Of course, differences between countries, cultures, economic status, and type of government will also affect the speed of direction and change of this transition. As investors, it is our responsibility to assess how these key groups can continue to create value. And all groups have a role to play in this transition to a future-proof economy. And they can also strengthen one another. Equally, they can act against each other if not well aligned. We can take our own responsibility both by understanding the existing dynamics between these groups and playing our role to stimulate this discussion about what value consists of. Let us first explore governments. We see two key dimensions here: intervention and cooperation. Intervention by governments in corporate affairs and cooperation between governments to address the issues brought into sharp focus by this crisis. The first key question is whether the financial support packages that are being offered by governments as financial stimulus and relief to the corporate world will be contingent and good and green behavior, or whether its withdrawal will be punishment for bad and non-responsible behavior. If we want to accelerate the transition to a fossil-free economy, when countries and companies start to recover, how will this be tackled and what are the results of these different approaches? We also see the level of cooperation between different governments playing a key role in how sustainability can be maintained for the longer term. Because when economies recover, we do want to have the positive effects on the environment maintained and not just as a short bump in time. We've seen both examples of superb international cooperation during this crisis on a medical level, but we've also seen unilateral and protectionistic measures. Are these mainly responses to the current crisis, or will one or both become more systematic? Let us now take a look at the role of corporates. COVID-19 underscores our dependence on economic stability, which in turn rests on corporate profitability. At the same time, one of the most prominent developments accelerated by this pandemic is a growing understanding of the real value of being a good corporate citizen. That means a corporate should look after its customers, its employees, and other stakeholders, rather than exclusively focused on investors or shareholders. To what extent will corporates be able and willing to adopt a more stakeholder-broad approach compared to a shareholder-first approach? And if a multi-stakeholder perspective becomes the driver for value creation, we can expect non-financial parameters to become a determining factor in assessing and predicting value creation. In this sense, things that were previously seen as non-financial value creators will now become true drivers of financial value. Allow me to remind you, this gives a new role to environmental, social, and governance factors. When looking at financial value, and we see both social and governance factors as becoming at least equal factors in driving that value. Governance becomes an even more relevant tool for assessing the resilience and quality of corporate management. In the past, it was an instrument to check on quality. Now it's more and more an instrument to assess risks and opportunities. Have corporates the right policies and decision-making processes in place to make them adapt to new situations? The question remains still, who has the most influence on this change, on this transition? If a multi-stakeholder value creation model is a license to operate, who has the upper hand in exerting this pressure? And how long-term will this shift be? We still see corporates currently having the most opportunity to drive this change, but we cannot yet say if their voice will be the loudest. And this will bring us to the last of the three, the role of the individual, people like you and me. Because the crisis has impacted our daily lives and heightened our awareness of health and social issues, as well as the environment surrounding us in a very, very tangible way. In some cases, it has made people more aware of their own behavior. Key question is, to what extent will action follow in the form of new long-term patterns of behavior and consumption? A short example, food choices. If individuals are now forced into a new trade-off between food they can afford versus food that is sustainably produced, will the trend of more sustainably sourced food continue? Or will the current economic situation decide that people will take the previous choice? How will the different stakeholders influence these individual behaviors? like working from home, living a healthier lifestyle, or taking the less carbon alternatives in traveling. These dynamics can change radically and also rapidly. They're also highly dependent on wealth, economic and social stability, and cultural differences. Are we serious about inclusiveness when it costs us something as an individual? And is this a price we are willing to pay? Or will behaving sustainably become a privilege only for the happy few? Putting it all together, these developments at three levels are strongly connected and do influence one another. We need to create value whilst also avoiding the destruction of value. And that is the real balancing act. In order for us as investors to put our capital to work in the real economy, we need to understand the real underlying issues, and we should acknowledge the need to adapt to the future. Yes, there will be challenges ahead and differences to tackle. But as investors, we need to step up and take a role in this transition. Now, more than ever, it is for real.
Now more than ever it is for real, Adrie.
Indeed.
You are here with me in the studio, and I'm very happy to say that we are also joined live by Professor Stiglitz in New York. Thank you so much to the both of you for your insightful keynotes and simply for being here. It's very exciting. Now, before we start with the questions that come in from the audience, I can imagine that maybe the both of you might have a question for each other as well, and this is your chance. Adrie, maybe you want to kick things off and ask Professor Stiglitz one of your questions.
Yeah, if possible, yes, please. And thank you, Professor, for sharing your views. I hope everything is okay in New York, and really nice talking to you again. If I may, and I know you work in the academic ecosystem, in the same time you also give advice and talk to people and organizations. So if I may, my question would be, what would be your advice to us, being an asset manager, on our role in this very important transition?
Oh, I think you play a very important role. Obviously, there are important decisions both about how resources get allocated, but as you emphasized in your talk, when you look at different enterprises, one of the important things is to look at the governance of the enterprise, their decision-making processes. Have they, for instance, taken account of climate risk? Have they disclosed that climate risk? Have they taken a long-term view? To what extent are they paying livable wages to their workers? The pandemic has exposed the inequalities, certainly within American society. And some of the more responsible firms have really woken up and said, we didn't realize that we were not really paying livable wages.
Okay, so thank you. Governance factors. Thank you so much.
Now, Professor Stiglitz, I think you were already listening in while Adrie was having his keynote here. Is there maybe something that you would like to ask him following that keynote?
Well, maybe just to pick up on what we've just been talking about. Has he seen workers taking a more active role in the corporation, as has happened in the United States and in a number of cases where young people have said they don't want to work for a firm that doesn't have responsible policies. And in some sense, the workers really almost forcing the firms to take a more responsible position.
Great question, actually. And what we do see as investors when we talk to companies, that companies already acknowledge the fact that if they want to attract talent, bright young people from universities, they are in need of a purpose of a company. Young, bright people want to work for companies who are clear about their role and responsibility in society. So from that part of your question, yes, it is become important. And taking the other side of people already working in a company, what you see in the companies that really take their role seriously, they try to commit their employees and really make sure that the purpose of the company is also being carried not as a burden, but also as a way of inclusiveness, and make sure that the next steps are embraced by the people who work there. Because at the end, that makes also the acceleration and the change faster. So yes, emphasis on people. Great.
I see a lot of questions coming in, so I'm just going to kick it off because we have about half an hour left, and I would like to give as many people as possible the opportunity to chat with you today. Adrie, the first question is for you, because someone says it's great that NNIP has such a progressive view about how things should be, but what are you actually doing as a company to make things happen?
Yeah, I understand the question. For a financial company, of course, the real impact is actually indirect. It's how we put our capital to work. And I might say that the way how we do it, we already took since a long time these E, S, and G factors, or at least the other view of the stakeholders, also into perspective. So what do we really do is make sure that if we deploy a capital in society, in the economy, it's exactly also what Professor Stiglitz said, taking a long-term view. Looking beyond only the financial metrics, making sure that other metrics that we deem are important for that specific investment are taken into account and given a proper place in the investment making decision. All
right. I have a question for both of you actually that's coming in, and it's regarding government involvement. Government involvement in the economy and in financial markets appears to be growing and arguably much needed as well. Do you see any unexpected or less obvious consequences of this shift, Professor Stiglitz?
Well, obviously, when you have government intervening in the scale that it does, it will have consequences, sometimes debatable. I mentioned in my talk the context where France demanded, as they gave money to the airlines, that they reduce their carbon footprint. That's really playing a very positive role in trying to shift the economy to the kind of green economy that we like. Let me give you an example on the other side in the United States. The Federal Reserve has talked about buying up effectively junk bonds. Many of us are worried that that policy will create what we call moral hazard, will encourage firms to undertake excessive debt, making them less resilient, more vulnerable to any shock. So it seems to me that there needs to be a little bit awareness of how actions taken in this pandemic should not be rewarding bad behavior.
Right, right. And Adrie, do you have anything to add? Do you see any unexpected things happening there that you think we should bear in mind?
Yeah, it's always difficult to say something after Professor Stiglitz, but first thing is expect the unexpected. That's always the case. On the other side, what you see now was also the last couple of days announced that in Korea, where $100 billion being invested, and you see that the government is then investing it in specifically long-term things like 5G network or electrification. So what is then the consequence or unexpected is actually what is expected, because for instance in Korea they are putting it into mobility, which is also an important sector, and tech in that country. So in that sense it's not that unexpected where they put their money to work, but it is, like Professor Stiglitz said, there are some consequences, of course, at hand.
Right. Professor Stiglitz, another question coming in for you. Would humanization at work be one of the solutions for sustainable companies to remain attractive and therefore also for sustainable investment?
Can you read the question again?
I'm sorry, you didn't hear it. Sorry, I'll repeat. Would humanization at work be one of the solutions for sustainable companies to remain attractive and therefore also for sustainable investment?
Yeah, I think collective action, unions have played a very important role. And one of the things that has hurt, I think, American enterprise is that there is less opportunity for workers to articulate their common concerns, that too often it's viewed as us versus them, workers versus the owners of the company. I think that's the wrong view. I think the workers have a grounds up view of what is going on. If you can a perspective which sees this as a cooperative activity, all working together rather than a conflictual activity, then it could be more profitable, and both the shareholders and the workers and the communities in which they live can benefit.
The secret lies in working together more in that sense, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you have any suggestions on how that cooperation could improve?
Well, some countries have actually explored ways of systematically taking the perspectives of workers into account. Simple things like suggestion boxes, but actually more organized ways of trying to get the participation of the workers into discussion circles. What are the problems? I mean, after all, as I say, the workers are the people on the ground who know what are the bottlenecks, what are the problems, and more cooperation as opposed to more division, I think is the way that one has to do it. And one has to structure that. I mean, that's what good organization is about. It's trying to structure people to interact in a positive way, and make them understand that there is a cooperative interest as opposed to a conflictual situation.
Exactly. Everyone has a role to play, so to say. Professor Stiglitz, another question coming in for you. What is your view on the EU Green Deal? Post-crisis, could it be a blueprint for the private and public sectors to build climate and social resilience? The EU Green Deal.
Very much so. I'm very supportive of what Europe is doing, at least in its vision. We'll have to see how it's carried out, of course. And, there are some critical decisions that are going to be made at the end of this week. I think it's obviously a first-order priority to make sure that Europe as a whole shows solidarity to some of the countries that have been most negatively afflicted, that the only way to do that is by raising the Euro bonds, and they have to give the money to, I think, Italy and Spain and the other afflicted countries through grants, not loans. These countries are already in debt and so form of the money has to be in loans. I think they should consider some innovative financial instruments like councils, perpetuities, so that when we build a bridge, we often borrow like for 40 years. It's going to be a long term, but it's the length of the debt needs to be matched to the length of the investment. Well, we're investing in our planet by the green investment. And the nature of the planet is hopefully that it is a long-term investment, a perpetuity. And the idea of issuing councils, as they're called, or perpetuities, has been done when we fought other major wars. This is a major war to protect our planet, our climate. And I think that therefore it makes some sense to start thinking about the issuance of these councils, which would put less of a financial burden in terms of rolling over the debt than the conventional short-term bond that governments use, we want long-term thinking, and long-term bonds councils represent the kind of long-term thinking that we want to encourage.
Yeah. Anything to add there, Adrie, from your perspective on the green bonds?
No,
on the Green Deal, sorry.
No. I think the professor is perfectly right. It's partly a blueprint, and what I like about it is it also provides a lot of transparency, and that it makes sure that the things that are being done have a sort of combined effect of both economy and ecology. So it is the Green Deal agenda, but actually it's the Green Economy Deal agenda.
Well, that ties in.
Yeah, can I just add one? Let me just add one thing. I mean, one of the things is that you're getting this money to you to do double duty, and that's going to be very important. You know, there is going to be a scarcity of resources, a scarcity of funds, and we want those funds that we're spending to both help the recovery from the pandemic, but also move our economy to the kind of economy that we want in the future.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Professor, could the use of metrics, ratings based on the SDGs provide a new set of efficient measures, along with the traditional ones for sustainable economic activity?
Yes, I think we absolutely have to use these new measures. I mean, we saw in the 2008 crisis that GDP looked like it was doing very well, but the economy was not economically sustainable. And our current metrics don't reflect the vulnerability of enterprises or our overall economy to climate risk. We didn't have any metric that reflected the resilience. All of us have been talking about resilience. We've seen the lack of resilience. You know, our ESG measures are pointing us in the right direction. And I think there's going to be a lot of work to do to get better ESG measures, you know, to pick up notions of vulnerability and resilience. This is a work in progress, but what is clear is that the old measures do not suffice. And I think just discussing these notions of governance, sustainability, the concepts that we've been talking about, I think is really important. And there are metrics that give us at least a better inkling of where we are than just ignoring them, which has been what we've done in the past.
Adrie, what role should private responsible investors play in building developed and developing markets' resilience post-COVID-19?
Developed and developing markets. It's a broad question. Maybe I can split it up a bit. I think investors can play a role. Let's not make any doubts about that. There is a role to play, and I would almost say, please take up that role. Take up the role, like we also take up that role. And it's exactly what we should do. Is if investment choices are made, I'm hesitant to repeat exactly what the professor said, but it's you make sure that you put multiple value creation at the center stage. So look at profitability of investments, because investments, after all, are also there for profitability, but check how this profitability comes about, how this can be sustained, because sustainability is a verb. It's our ability to sustain. So it's not only how the profit is attained, but also can be continued. And if you take that as your leading question, immediately, exactly on what just Professor said, ESG metrics, other type of valuations come into place. So investors both in emerging as in developing countries. So that doesn't make any difference, but take them into account and make it happen.
Professor, how has COVID-19 affected the knowledge economy, and what advice would you have for countries on how they could create a more green economy?
Well, the knowledge economy in the United States has been very badly affected, and obviously different countries have different systems, and I've been focusing a lot on how the knowledge economy has been almost devastated in the United States. That's partly because in the United States, we have more dependence on state and local governments and on foundations. Where it shows up is our universities, of course. Our students can't get together because we haven't controlled the pandemic in the way that New Zealand and South Korea and much of Europe has controlled the pandemic. So we are still very worried about holding classes and obviously working together, getting together with our students, doing research with our colleagues is at the center of the knowledge economy. And so we've been put on hold. We've done remarkably well on Zoom and other remote, we've adapted. And that's, you know, I've been impressed at how resilient, you might say, we've been, but the difficulties that the research and knowledge sector has faced, it is really a little bit almost traumatic. Mm-hmm. The sources of money have been also very badly affected because in the United States, the state governments have balanced budget frameworks, which means the revenues are plummeting. They can't borrow money, and that means they're cutting back expenditures, and that means access to education at every level is going to be devastated. So fortunately, Europe has a better framework for addressing these issues, but it is going to be one of the things that as the budget deficits become more apparent, and they will become apparent in all countries, one of the important things is priorities are going to have to be set. And among the priorities, I think, has to be the two things that you mentioned, the knowledge sector and the green transition. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Of course, there's a difference between developed countries and developing countries. How will the acceleration towards a sustainable economy differ between those two? And how can they potentially collaborate on achieving something? Professor.
Well, one of the things I mentioned very briefly in my talk is that there needs to be global cooperation. We won't get a strong economic recovery until the whole world is recovered. Mm-hmm. I emphasize that in 2008, China played a very big role in fueling the recovery. It had growth 11, 12, 13%. That's not going to happen this time. No. And so it's going to be even more important that every part of the country, of the world, have a strong recovery. Yeah. Now, what worries me right now, and again, I mentioned it very briefly, is that a number of countries, emerging markets, are going to be facing debt crises. They borrowed too much in the past. Understandable, you might say, what interest rates were as low as they were. Yep. And so they took on a lot of debt. But now, some of the financial institutions, like BlackRock in the United States, have taken a very recalcitrant position. You know, companies that put themselves up as responsible firms. You know, so this is part of the disparity sometimes between the rhetoric and the reality. Mm-hmm. They talk about being a responsible investor, but when push came to shove, and they had to put, they had to actually do what they were supposed to do, and there was a need for restructuring the debt. The IMF was very clear what Argentina could afford, and they said, "Oh, we're not going to listen to the IMF. We're not going to listen to Argentina. We're not going to pay any attention to the pandemic even." Mm-hmm. Argentina's been devastated by the pandemic, and they've gone ahead and said, we're going to be recalcitrant, and we're going to demand more money than the country can sustainably afford. Mm-hmm. No matter if that causes people to die. Mm-hmm. Now, that's bad economics. It's bad politics. I think it's going to tarnish the reputation of responsible investing. Yeah. And so I think it's really important that there be action behind some of the words.
Yeah, yeah. and I have to give you the floor here as well, Ali, to maybe add something from an investor's perspective.
Yeah, well, and again, I said it also before, I will agree with the professor. And the global collaboration and global cooperation is extremely needed. Also from the perspective of what I described as the three key stakeholder groups, but also if you look for the survival to thriving mode and the things that are ahead of us is also next to this health issue which we need to solve, is that then that we also need to solve the global warming. And therefore, we really need also this global cooperation. So we need, even referring to Mr. Diamandis, we need this positive attitude. We need this positive way of trying to help each other, but then also collaboratively seeking each other, finding a way to jointly get this thing done, or at least get to work to it.
Yeah, and then there's always human behavior then, isn't there?
Absolutely.
And one of the questions that we get in, maybe Adri, you can answer this one, isn't the current consumer-centric economic system based on our choice of not creating resilience so we sustain the consumption? And what economic social shifts do we need to build such a resilience?
Okay, quite a complicated question, if I may say, but I think I will try to answer it, I think, in two ways. I mean, as responsible investors, we are not against consumption per se, or not against economic growth per se. I mean, you need certain products to make sure that you have a life worth living, and also for the future of your family and for all the things that you care about. So in that sense, but it is about the choices you made within I think that frame, within the set. So when do you choose to go on a certain way of transportation? You can always choose. Sometimes I've said in the past, we live in an era of choice. We have the choice on certain things. And as we make, as consumers, a choice, we can also, with our choice, steer the direction a bit. We can guide it a bit. And of course, we're also dependent on what companies offer us, but no is also an answer, or not doing something is also an answer. Then the second part of the question is, what does it mean for us from the investing side also? I do think that looking at sectors where especially this consuming thing goes on, I'm thinking of, in the meantime, I'm thinking of an example. If you look at beverage, for instance, nowadays, and we all know beverages, it's summertime, especially in certain parts of the world. People not always are aware that to produce these beverages, enormous amounts of water are needed. So in that sense, we saw even, especially in the Netherlands this year, that water companies who also prepared utilities, made sure that the water is there, said, be careful with consumption. Make sure. For companies, that's even a dramatic event, because then they cannot make their products. So as consumers, we do have influence. As investors, we have to take care of it. We even have to look at the weather, maybe even. So these are, again, these non-financial parameters, these non-financial factors that become into play into both what consumers do and then the ultimate event on what the economy. And that's exactly what we're discussing today, how these things interact and maybe even can counter each other if they're not well aligned. I do hope I answered the question a bit on this way.
Yeah, and I would like to...
Can I just add?
Oh, yes, sorry, please. Go ahead.
Sure, let me just add a word. I chaired an international commission with Lord Stern at the UK, and we asked the question, can we meet the 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, Paris, Copenhagen goals, and yet continue economic growth, kind of economic prosperity? And our answer was unambiguous. The answer is yes. Obviously, we have to change patterns of consumption, what we consume, how we consume, so there are going to be very big changes, but they're not that big change. You know, that just subtly moving a little bit more towards, you might say, vegetarian, away from beef, all kinds of moving from air travel to Zoom. At the margin, these things add up in a way that means that we actually can achieve those 1.5 to 2 degree centigrade goals. And I think that's European Green program is all about, and I think it's attainable.
And of course, when we think, at least when I think about consumption, the United States come to my mind as well. What do you see happening there, and do you see any changes that could hopefully, possibly, positively influence this?
Well, I'm optimistic.
That's good.
Just in the last day, Vice President Biden has announced a very aggressive green program, and I'm very optimistic that we will have a change in administration in November.
Yeah.
And if that happens, I think the United States will join the rest of the world in the quest to have a world which is basically close to or fully 100% equivalent renewable by 2050.
I think we would very much welcome you back on that platform. To what extent, Professor, do we need to adjust the supply chain is something that someone's asking.
Well, clearly, I think we've seen that our supply chains are not resilient. As I mentioned in my talk, I was shocked that the inability of our private sector to produce masks, to produce simple products, let alone complicated products like tests and ventilators. And much of that has result of our creating these supply chains that were not resilient, that we focused on saving a penny here and a penny there at the expense of exposing ourselves to risk. And we now realize that there are many, many kinds of risks that we don't always fully foresee. So I think there's going to be a reassessing of these supply chains. But let me emphasize, we're not talking about deglobalization in a protectionism, kind of a global Trumpism, if you were. That would be wrong. What I think is very clear, and I emphasized, was that we're going to need global cooperation to deal with the pandemic and to deal with climate change. So if anything, it's going to be more cooperative, but I think more thoughtful about diversification.
Great. I have a very long question here for you, Adri.
Okay.
Stay tuned. Sorry, something's changing in my... to what extent does the current trend towards a more sustainable economy change the way we look at ESG metrics as investors?
The most honest answer is it doesn't, in my view, or it shouldn't. Or maybe there will be a bit of more maybe emphasis or accent, because what we just seen is that in the financial industry, people now have recognized much more than before that taking these ESG factors into account really make more resilient portfolios. That is something that is not new. So in that sense, no. However, it's also what the professor said about the right metrics. So, I think about certain things that do work, but we will probably tweak and do a little bit more on left or right. And because there's now so much data becoming available, and there's now suddenly a sort of extra emphasis on getting this information, we probably need a bit more of sort of also the artificial intelligence to process that information. In that sense, that will be a sort of I would almost say positive or next step in ESG data, but for the rest, no. It is here to stay, and it will stay, and it will get maybe more profound, but no real changes in my view.
I'm already at the end of this Q&A. The time is flying by, but I'm going to give both of you one final question just to wrap up. I think we hear a lot of good ideas, but sometimes when it comes to being responsible, I think there's this, well, what can I do as a person, as an individual, what can I do? Is there any recommendation or advice that the both of you would have in that regard? Adri, maybe, what are your thoughts?
I like the question, by the way, Marije. Well, if it is as an individual, don't make it too complicated, in my view. I mean, there are many things you can do, and because there are many things, maybe you don't get started. So, but every small step is a good step, as long as it's also in the right direction. Some small steps could be, is what I have done, is looking at my garden. For instance, remove some tiles, put more earth, because again, about the drought and water, make sure that I make sure that water remains longer in the ground. Second thing, put more trees, more green, so biodiversity. I got lots of butterflies nowadays in my garden, I think, and it's something you also enjoy. So I think the small things should be taken step by step, and it adds, combined, very simply, up to combating climate change. So in that sense, small steps, big impact.
And we spend a lot of time in our gardens now with the working from home situation, so it's nice to have a beautiful garden, I can imagine. Professor Stiglitz, last words for you. Would you have any advice or recommendations for the people listening in on what they can do on an individual level?
Well, I just would add one more thing to what Adri said. Little things add up, but one has to think about everything comprehensively. Mm-hmm. So as your individual consumer decision, bottled water versus tap water, when you buy that bottle of water, there's a lot of oil that goes into delivering that bottle of water. Yep. So that's an example of a little thing, the gardens, what you eat. But I also want to emphasize that we play a role in many, many different ways. We're workers, we're investors, we're citizens who vote, we're consumers. In every one of these roles, we are making decisions. Mm. And we have a voice in every one of these roles. Sometimes our voice isn't very loud. Sometimes we feel like we're not being listened to. Mm-hmm. We do have a voice. And when everybody exercises that voice, collectively, it does make a difference. So I want to emphasize that in every one of your roles, as a citizen, as an investor, as a consumer, think about the impact of what you're doing, and how if you and all the other citizens act in a similar way, we actually can shift the direction of our society. And if nobody does it, of course it won't change. No. So it's only through this kind of recognition that we do have, with others in concert, a real power to change our society and our economy.
Yeah, we'll remember that. Every little step matters. This was another really enlightening and thought-provoking discussion. I would like to thank you, Adri, for being here with me in the studio, and definitely also want to thank Professor Stiglitz for joining us from New York. It was so wonderful to have you. We've been really, it was great. We learned a lot. Now for the audience, if there are any questions that you have been asking that have not been treated today, I tried to treat as many as possible, but if not, we will try and get back to them the next time we are with you. Now it's almost time for summer, and I know some of you might be taking a break, but there's two more exciting parts of the Upside Down series that I'd like to share with you. First of all, we want you to know about a special responsible investing summer course that has been put together exclusively for you, the participants in the Upside Down series. We've brought together a number of professors from different leading universities, such as Yale and the London Business School, because we would like to continue the dialogue that we started with you today on these topics. So stay tuned. More details will come later this week in an email that will be shared with you. And then secondly, also, please join us again in September for the next event in this Upside Down series, where we will explore what COVID-19 means for the corporate world. For now, please stick around if you would like to join the networking event. From my side, I would like to thank you again for joining us. I wish you a wonderful summer, and depending on wherever you are in the world, have either a good day or a good night. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.